Okay.
Bio.
Well, John, Ken's Christmas
This
is
is more
supposed to be
about
coming in as a
Yeah.
guest also.
Yeah.
And so the two of you can split the group
Yeah.
over here working on
I heard
paperwork
that you
today.
can just buy
Okay.
If for
little
some reason Ken doesn't
TV
show
door
up,
and then you can
I'll do, yeah.
okay, with
links up
Yeah.
in the air.
I used to know some of the rules and stuff when I was younger, but I don't know the current rules. I know, in the old rules, you had to take care of yourself.
Jerry, good to see you. Take care.
I think, well, there was always the novice, get started. I don't know what the regulations are now. They do have, I guess you saw them.
I remember these.
You just send messages that way. Yeah. We used to have them like that.
$249.
I saw him out doing Arizona. We have a grandson. Where is he in London?
Well, he is the youngest.
Construction or construction, I don't know which.
Probably construction.
All right. So the place started about 20 years ago, and it's an offshoot of an organization called the Mid-Atlantic Antique Radio Club, which is a very active club of guys who collect, fix, repair antique radio and televisions and the associated equipment. They had so much stuff, they wanted to show it off to the public. And the city of Bowie had rehabilitated this farmhouse, intending for it to be an arts sort of place for artists to work, but that fell through. So they started a radio and television museum here with all stuff donated mostly by members of Mark. It's still a very active club. They meet once a month, trade and swap stuff, repair things.
You know, I see your name, and it reminds me, I went to school with a John Anderson.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I did
Well,
too.
the reason that his name popped up is a friend of mine in the last month or so told me that he died.
Ah, sorry to hear that.
He was a presidential candidate.
That what?
He was a presidential candidate.
1980, we ran for president. we
Yeah,
lost.
that's you. That's from, what was it, Indiana? Either Indiana or Illinois. Midwest.
He did. He ran against Reagan.
Could you keep on playing the chimes? Could you play the chimes,
Play
Harry?
the chimes. Play the chimes.
So I'm gonna get started on talking about the place, if you wanna
Stop playing
join
right
us
there.
all.
Let's start talking. Thank you.
In here, probably best.
Okay.
So,
Guess we're starting.
yeah, we'll get started. So I told some of you that the museum started about 20 years ago as an offshoot of the Mid-Atlantic Antique Radio Club, which is a group of collectors, pretty large in this area, Virginia, DC. They collect radios and televisions and other ephemera associated with it. And they had so much stuff in their attics, in their basements, in their rooms, they thought they wanted to share it with the public. And started this museum. Brian Belanger was one of those folks, and he's been associated with it forever. He's the curator and set up most of the exhibits and stuff. Myself, I'm retired from Johns Hopkins as a physician. My connection with this, though, goes back to the fact that my grandfather's brother was a telegrapher for Western Union for 50 years. Pretty fast hand with the telegraph. My father had a degree in radio and television engineering in 1940 before he served in the Signal Corps. And the first time...
I can hear you with the radio.
Oh, sorry, I'm bumping into it. And my first contact with television was 1948 when I was 2.5 years old. That's the first time we had a television, right at the peak of television coming on in the United States. And I've watched television until my eyes are ready to fall out much of the time. So I'm pretty familiar with television in the 50s and 60s, which is about when the museum stops, when transistors became the way things went, and Sony and Panasonic became the dominant companies. The museum stopped. Okay, there are transistor radios here. There's actually, if you look over here when we go by it, the first transistor radio built for the public in 1954. It was actually built in the United States. Probably the first and the last of a group that were ever built here. So that's it in general. So
The early transistor radios, the only thing I remember, if you looked at them, they were built in Japan, and the soldering was terrible.
it's a lot better now, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm used to teaching medical students, residents, fellows, and I'm used to doing it in a certain way. So I ask questions.
I'm
All right.
Kathy.
Hi, Bob Ehrlich.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm going to start off with a question,
Yeah.
Right, okay.
and I hope most of you know the answer. During the Revolutionary War, if George Washington had wanted to send a message from, say, Philadelphia to Boston, how would he have done it?
My horse.
Carrier?
By horse.
Carrier pigeons.
Horse, yeah.
Yeah.
Probably by
Or-
boat, actually.
or
But not a
pigeon.
person.
Or by boat, yeah.
Yeah.
Pigeons.
So, instantaneous communication didn't exist in the Revolutionary War, right?
Right.
Oh, you're not right.
Well,
There's a very famous poem that goes, one if by land, two if by sea.
Right.
And the one and the two were lights,
Yeah.
okay? So instantaneous communication did exist during the time of the
Yeah,
Revolutionary
very
War.
Well,
limited.
not quite instantaneous.
But only line of sight.
Line of sight, okay? Line of sight communication in the form of semaphores, flags, smoke signals, torches, had in fact been described in the 6th century BC by the Greeks, okay? Who had a very, very complicated system of 5x5 torches where they could actually send the Greek alphabet, depending on how, there were 25 letters. And with 5x5 torches, they could
Did the
send.
receiver have a pencil and paper to write them down?
I don't know, and I don't know how effective it
Probably
was,
a stylus and a piece of clay.
Yeah, right.
but it could be
Chisel
done.
it in stone.
But it could be done. In the 18th century, the French actually set up a semaphore system of sort of like windmill towers, where they could send messages between Paris and Lille about 130 miles, using various combinations of where where the semaphores were set up. So a sort of instantaneous communication was available, but it was line of sight, okay? And not very practical, because you had to repeat it every time in every station. Not very useful. So when Lincoln was president, if he had wanted to send a message from Washington D.C. to Boston, how would he have done it?
Really?
No, it would have been
Telegraph.
telegraph. Telegraphs
Telegraph.
existed during his time.
In 1844, Morse and his collaborators sent the first successful telegraph message between Baltimore and Washington, and said, "What hath God wrought?" The famous statement. Within 5 years, there were 12,000 miles of telegraph wires in the United States. By the time of the Civil War, virtually every community was connected by telegraph. And it was instantaneous, but it was pure code.
Okay.
And
If Lincoln wanted to send a message to one of his generals and they weren't in the city or something like that, he still needed someone to take it from the city.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
When the
The
signal
last mile is always the problem.
Yeah.
when the Signal Corps was started during the Civil War, it was started based on semaphores, not
Okay.
telegraphy. It was very difficult to use telegraphy on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was still a lot. I mean, the person who was hired by the government to start the Signal Corps was in fact a physician who had set up a semaphore code system and didn't know anything about telegraphy. Okay, so by 1866, when Andrew Johnson was president, what could he have done that Lincoln could not have done? And in fact did. He sent a message to London
That's-
by telegraphy because the undersea cable had finally been laid.
Transplant cable.
It took 5 times they tried before they got it to work. And in
Yeah,
fact,
it was very slow in transmitting.
it was terribly slow. If you want to look at it, this is a piece of the original undersea cable.
Look at this, Eric. Eric, take a look at this cable.
This is the wire that went from the United States to England.
Okay, they had an insulator around it?
Yeah, they used gutta percha. You know, the sort of sap from a tree, a little bit like latex they used to make golf balls out of. I think it's got 7 wires in the middle that serve as a transmission. These wires are all just
Structural.
structural.
Okay, so those wires are so it doesn't break.
Right.
Right.
And it broke many times in the process of trying to lay it.
Imagine unspooling that from a ship as you.
Yeah. So they first tried to lay this in 1858. They did get it across after a number of tries. It lasted about 2 to 3 weeks before it crashed. And the problem was that the British and the American engineers did not agree on the voltage to run it at. And the Americans ran it at high voltage, cooked it.
Well, I heard that they cranked up the voltage to try and get it
Right.
to work
Okay,
faster.
faster, was very slow.
Yeah.
They had no repeating system,
Yeah.
none at all.
And I guess it was, I'm not an engineer, but it was due to the capacitance of the cable.
Correct, yeah. Yeah. But by 1866, they were able to do it, okay?
Yeah,
But-
Lord Kelvin was involved in.
He was, yes. Yep. So, there were still large tracts of the world, though, even with the laying of cable in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. They were inaccessible to instantaneous communication. The Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, you simply could not communicate to a ship at sea. The cables were 2 miles down or more and not connected. Communication with ships at sea required new technology. And by chance, that technology came around just about then. It happened because of, how many of you guys are physicists?
Raise your hand, Jack.
What?
Now you're a
Yeah.
physicist.
What was the question?
How many of you guys are
Oh.
physicists? Okay, good. So, I see these lists about the greatest physicists in the history of the world, you know, top 10. So I'm gonna ask you, who are the top 10 or top 5 physicists in the history of the world? Newton, yeah.
Paul,
Einstein.
Adrian, Maurice, Dirac.
I know
Dirac.
How about
Galileo,
Maxwell?
Galileo.
Newton.
I'll buy that one.
Maxwell?
Maxwell.
How about Feynman?
Feynman.
And you know, Dirac was also an engineer, by the way.
Oh, okay. So my wife would say Marie Curie. Okay.
Yeah. You turn on the radio.
That would be accurate.
Spec.
I keep hitting the buttons.
You know, one of the Nobel Prizes in science.
Yeah, and her daughter did too.
My daughter did too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I've.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So at any rate, fortunately, Maxwell came around at the time when that last little bit of communications was needed, okay? I know there are 4 equations and Oliver Heaviside had something to do with it, and
Originally, there were 20.
there were many equations, yeah.
Because they had no vector notation.
And then there
Right.
was Oliver Heaviside squeezed them
Squeezed it
down
down to 4.
using vectors to.
Yeah. So,
And I think Newton named them as Maxwell's equation, not Newton, Einstein named them
Yeah.
as Maxwell's equation.
right. So at any rate, what did Maxwell equations do for us with what we're talking about today?
Marvelous.
Electromagnetic radiation.
Yeah. He proved that
Yeah.
light was electromagnetic radiation and that there were many infinite number of frequencies that we can't see.
And I guess Hertz verified a lot of this.
Yeah, and if I can figure out how to plug this darn thing in today, I'll show you Hertz's experiment in a minute. At any rate, yeah, and one of the things, Hertz, when he finally proved that Maxwell was right, said a couple of things that are interesting. He said that yep, there's electromagnetic radiation, which we can't see. All right, and he also said what uses it. He said nothing.
What?
Useless. He thought
Useless.
useless. Hertz said that what he had produced, radio waves, he didn't call it that then, was useless.
It was when he said it.
It was when he said it, yes. It was useless, literally, that's what he said, it was useless. So,
Hertz was interesting. He died about 35 years when he was 35 or 36.
yeah. If you've ever been to Edinburgh, he's a god in Edinburgh, Maxwell.
So let me tell you a tangent to that about useless. I was a student, my thesis advisor was Charlie Towns.
Oh.
And after the laser came for the first time, there were comments in the newspapers. It's a great idea, but what were we ever going to do with it?
Yeah, yeah, well, we don't know.
Well,
What it
yeah,
sounds
yeah.
like Thomas Watson, who said we'd only need 5 computers when he was president of IBM.
Yeah, well, what Bill Gates says, a memory of a 700K should be sufficient for anything.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes the leaders don't have great vision, although there were people with great vision
Yeah.
involved in radio and television. The way Hertz proved that Maxwell was in fact right was that he generated a spark. Now, I don't really know why he thought of the idea of using a spark to generate radio waves, but he did. And if you watch this little thing,
I see the spark.
this is not connected, okay? This is just a clothes hanger with a little incandescent bulb attached. But when I close the switch and generate a spark there, it lights up. He did a
Probably
lot.
neon bulb, I bet.
He actually generated another spark in his original experiment. He didn't have incandescent light bulbs that size.
What are you using for a transmitter?
The spark.
Spark?
There's a little spark
Okay,
being
okay,
created.
yeah, I see it, okay.
And that's enough to generate, and if you turn on this little guy, this semi-modern transistor radio, or it generates a pretty good signal. It really fouls out the amateur radio station over there when we've got
Yeah.
it running. And it probably transmits 100 yards around the building.
Yeah, I tried to do something like that, and as a transmitter, I had an old Model T 4 coil, but I never got it
Yeah.
to spark. I mean,
Yeah.
Well, that's
So-
good because they have so many Henrys. If it had sparked you, it might have stopped your heart.
Yeah.
well,
They're dangerous.
I wasn't touching anything when I.
Good.
So most of the scientific world said, great, you proved Maxwell was right. You proved that there are there's electromagnetic radiation that we can't see. All right. So I'm a physician, and this is the next question I've got for all of you physicists and engineers. Why can't we see radio waves? They're the exact same thing as light waves. Why can't we see them?
Long wavelengths.
Detectors in our eyes
Right.
don't respond to it.
Correct. The rhodopsin in the eye has much different energetics than you could produce with radio waves. But there's an even more fundamental reason why we can't see radio waves, and that is on an evolutionary basis. There was no advantage to seeing radio waves. Okay? Number one, how much radio waves are there before human beings started creating them in the atmosphere?
Lightning?
Lightning.
Yeah.
That's it.
The only thing in the natural environment that generates radio waves in the terrestrial environment is lightning. And we can see lightning. What's the advantage of evolving a way to detecting the radio waves produced by lightning? None.
You know, if we could see electromagnetic waves along with light waves, we might be bumping into doors and everything.
Right. The other thing is there's a huge advantage to being able to see light because it bounces off of things, and radio waves tend to penetrate. So you don't see that critter coming to get you if you're using radio waves as the way of detecting them until we created radar. There was no selective advantage. Extraterrestrial sources, well, the sun makes radio waves,
Oh, yeah.
but they don't penetrate the atmosphere terribly well like light waves do. And the amount of radio waves that come from the stars is infinitesimally small. And if you know how big a radio telescope is,
And how many they have.
they're gigantic in order to pick up signals. And it would be very difficult to create an image. You'd have to have an eye as big as a radio telescope. So there's really no reason that humans would ever have picked up the ability, or any animal would have picked up the ability to detect radio waves. So the scientific community, after Hertz produced this, and they were called Hertzian waves at the time. They weren't called radio waves until 1905 or 6. Didn't care. You know, the physicists of the world didn't do much with it.
Why are they called radio waves? What, did they think it had to do with radioactivity?
Yeah, it came from the use of radio with terms like radioactivity and whatever. The use of the word radio started with radioactivity.
Maybe radiation?
Radiation.
Well, gamma
yeah.
rays are
Right.
Electromagnetic radiation.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
But the use of the term radio was usually used with regard to radiation of like black bodies and stuff like that. The
It
use
still
of the,
scares people with cell
the use of the
phones.
term radio is what we use. It
Yeah.
came around in 1905 or 6. Lee DeForest, the guy who invented the triode vacuum tube, promoted it, as did the post office for some reason in England.
Let's see, DeForest wasn't granted a patent on that, was he?
Boy, was that a dispute that went on forever.
But-
So many
but-
patent
but,
disputes and all
from
of
what
this.
I read, DeForest really did not understand what
He
was
did not
happening.
understand what he invented.
Yeah.
He and Howard Armstrong, who was one of the geniuses of radio.
Is that his picture up there?
That's Armstrong, yeah.
The bald-headed.
The bald-headed guy. The other guy is is Sarnoff, whom we'll talk about a little later.
Yes.
The captain of industry. And then below him, any guesses?
Who?
16 years old, Mormon farm boy. He sees how corn is planted in rows, and he sits down and he draws a little picture of the electronic television, and ultimately was credited as the inventor of the electronic television.
And then-
Philo T. Farnsworth.
Farnsworth, yes.
Farnsworth?
Philo Farnsworth.
And he, of course, got into a large patent dispute with Sarnoff, which his wife eventually won.
Well, that sounds like Armstrong.
Oh, yeah, Sarnoff was a master of patent disputes.
Yeah. Well, he lost to Armstrong's wife.
Yes.
I think almost all of the patents that
Yes.
were contested
Yeah.
went to his wife.
Yeah,
Armstrong committed suicide.
he did, yeah, he jumped off a building. Yeah. Yes. So at any rate, getting back to what happened after Hertz. Hertz didn't think there was anything to come of it. Lots of people in the scientific and academic community didn't think much would come of it, but there were about 4 or 5 guys who really thought this was something important. Tesla in the United States fiddled around with it. A guy in Russia did. Oliver Lodge in England, and a couple of others. But the person who really made something of it was Marconi. Now Marconi was Italian and Irish Protestant. His mother was from the UK and was Irish Protestant. You may have even heard of her family name, Jameson, the whiskey company,
Okay.
which is still around.
John Jameson and Son.
Yeah. Well, she inherited that fortune. Marconi's mother. So he was born to wealth, both in Italy.
Lodge was
and-
also rich.
Yes. And Marconi, when he was very young, got into radio and became a very good experimentalist and inventor. And he pursued it with a passion. He didn't accept, number one, that it was only going to be line of sight as gospel, just because people said it was true. And he worked on improving it. The first thing he did, let me show you this gadget. Soon after, when Hertz created the spark, he detected it, I said, by producing another spark. But soon thereafter, a guy named Branly invented the coherer, which is a glass tube full of metal filings. And when there are radio waves in and around the metal filings, they do something called cohering, which reduces the resistance to an electric current. So when I push this thing here and generate radio waves here, these things cohere inside and closes the circuit, and it prints it out. Okay? Now the other thing you have to do is you have to bang it with a little hammer to uncohere it so that it'll work the next time around. Marconi took that thing from Branly, and he spent a lot of time trying to figure out which were the best metal filings to work, be the most sensitive, and he came up with nickel and silver. He also figured out that the bigger the spark, the further you could send the signal, and he knew you had to have a big spark generator to do what he wanted to do, and he worked on that. The other thing that he discovered, and others did, particularly Tesla, was you needed a big antenna with a good ground.
Okay.
You did those 3 things, and this stopped being line of sight. Okay.
Okay. Well, Tesla built some big antennas.
He did. Tesla built big antennas. He did indeed. At any rate, Marconi went from sending a signal from about 1.5 miles to 4 miles to 8 miles. Finally, he was drafted by the Italian army and forced to go back to Italy. But they realized he had real potential, much more than being an infantryman. So he continued to work on radio while he was in Italy. And finally there, in 1897, he sent a signal further than line of sight. He sent it 11.5 miles.
Okay.
Okay, which is over the horizon. Now, they didn't know about ground effects or the ionosphere or anything like that, but that convinced him and investors in England that he should form a company and try to send a signal across the Atlantic.
Now, what year is this?
1897.
Thank you.
So his wife's nephew was an engineer who also had a lot of contacts throughout the engineering community in England, so that helped a lot. And he started to build this gigantic thing. There's a picture somewhere I've got here, I can show it to you. What he ultimately ended up building was a giant spark generator. But he had an even bigger building generating electricity full of smoke and coal smoke to generate the size spark he wanted. I mean, it was a monstrous undertaking. Gigantic antennas set up in the United States and in the UK. The antennas blew down. So he was a little bit delayed and ended up doing it, connecting the UK with Newfoundland rather than the United States. His first signal was the letter S, People disputed whether or not it had actually happened because there were no independent observers. And some people said, nah, it's probably just mishearing or hearing what you want to hear or whatever. So then he set out on a ship from the UK and sent signals from the UK to the ship, and picked up the signal at 400 miles, 800 miles, and so forth, all the way across the Atlantic, with the ship's crew being the witnesses to the fact that it had happened, and became world famous. The data, the signal was not, he couldn't pick it up all the way across the Atlantic, and a couple of physicists took the data and said, it's the reflection off the ionosphere. So they used his data to come up with showing that existed, and that's how radio waves could actually do further than the line of sight. So he formed a company, and the idea was to sell this to ships and to the Navy, okay? So they put these sort of spark generators on ships, passenger ships, Navy ships, merchant ships. There were a couple of instances before 1912 where people had actually been saved in shipwrecks from because of Marconi's radio, but the most famous was the Titanic. In 1912, there was a Marconi radio shack aboard the Titanic. He was a good businessman too, not just a good tinker and engineer. The radio people were his employees, not the ships. And one of the ways he made money was that he charged the first-class passengers money to send messages to their families at either side of the shore. It was not primarily intended as contacting other ships, but the Titanic managed to contact other ships.
I had heard that the radio operator was sort of overwhelmed with various sending
Right.
messages and things like that.
Private messages.
So basically, information about coming into an ice field or whatever
Correct.
may have been delayed.
Yeah, one of the other ships that might have picked it up, they were just too busy with sending private messages. It was not about ship-to-ship contact. After the Titanic, the United States and the UK mandated that ships had to have it, and ship-to-ship communication had to exist. So that's where it stood around, in the 1906, 1907 through 1912.
Were the signals just telegraph signals?
Yes, yeah. There was no, you cannot modulate sparks. Okay. I mean, they're just broad, like that. You just can't modulate sparks.